A War for Women. The essential question is, how did World War I affect women's rights before and after the war? By Sam Timmons. When Americans reflect on World War I, many think of Central Powers taking on the Allied powers. However, though this may be true, very few seem to address how this war served as a catalyst for women's suffrage to finally be addressed on a federal scale and enrich countless lives as a result. Movements for the improvement of women's rights began in the mid-1800s. This is when abolitionists and women joined forces after realizing their shared frustrations, hosting the first meeting of the American Equal Rights Association post-Civil War. Before the World War began, women's rights were very restricted. According to Moody, suffrage activists had long drawn on an egalitarian strain of Enlightenment thinking to argue that equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence applied to women as well as men. Members of the National Women's Party turned to radical efforts to try and claim their rights as American citizens in the early 1900s after World War I. According to the supplemental source, women's rights movements became very forceful and radical. Many members went on hunger strikes, slashing famous paintings, chaining themselves to fences, etc., all in hopes to advance their movement. The United States entered the war 3 years after it started in August of 1914. According to Mooney, most leaders of the women's suffrage movement enthusiastically supported the war effort. Many volunteered, became nurses, and involved themselves in hopes of eventually winning equal rights for women. However, President Wilson's claim "we're making the world safe for democracy" wasn't accepted by members of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, such as President Carrie Chapman Catt. This was because women were not given a role in the so-called Democratic government. Later, the NWP expanded this effort under Alice Paul by picketing at the White House. The NWP was led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Both women played a vital role in the following years in the fight for women's suffrage, and would go on to develop one of the main movements advocating for other issues, including the Equal Rights Amendment. Due to the Espionage Act of 1917, these protests were viewed as quote-unquote public acts of disloyalty, and police arrested more than 200 members of the picketing NWP. During their incarceration, many led hunger strikes regardless of their lewd treatment within the prisons. What those who were imprisoned endured can be viewed as traumatic, scandalous, or even taboo. The brutal management and force-feeding of these women greatly assisted their efforts nonetheless. President Wilson was appalled by the treatment of these women, causing him to embrace women's rights later that same year, joining efforts with his daughter, Jessie Woodrow Wilson Sayre. In fact, Wilson utilized the NWP and the war effort to catapult women's rights into actuality. According to Mooney, he argued that a women's suffrage amendment was vital to winning the war. The 19th Amendment was finally granted, extending voting rights to everyone regardless of sex. The passing of the 19th Amendment finally gave women the voice they deserved on the federal scale. This opened up the floor to a plethora of issues that were still in debate, such as abortion laws. This has since spawned a sense of urgency amongst young women across the U.S. to band together in efforts to protect these rights. Women today still endure countless attacks towards them, but the fight progresses. The efforts we know of women in the early 1900s stay echoing throughout our modern age of pussy hats, third-wave feminism, and women serving in Congress.